Hello again. In this third introductory tutorial to Daylight, I will cover the process of adding a basic look to the shots we've imported into this scene by applying some simple colour grades. Now at the moment, we're viewing the scene in the player workspace, and if you remember from the last tutorial, we chose a Daylight setup which includes the image display within our user interface monitor. For colour grading, I would normally use a separate calibrated reference display, but for these tutorials it's easier to see what's going on if I run Daylight with this single display setup. Okay, I'm now going to switch over to the Grade workspace. This can be selected from the Views menu or by pressing Ctrl-Shift-2 on the keyboard. Now the first time you switch to the Grade workspace after creating a new job, you will be asked to choose a format for the per job gallery. I'll explain more about galleries and formats later, but for now you can just accept the default and click on OK. Right, so this is the Grade workspace. The Shots view in the Player workspace has been replaced with this row of thumbnails, which we refer to as the Cuts view. It shows the shots in the order they were selected in the Shots view and acts a bit like a timeline. We can drag the shots left and right using the mouse, and we can scale the thumbnails by dragging the top or bottom splitter bars. Notice that if I keep dragging the splitter bars, you will see that the Cuts view turns into multiple rows of thumbnails, presenting the scene in a kind of storyboard fashion. This can be a useful way to see more of the scene in one go, but it can also be used as a way to manually reorder the shots for playback. You'll need to enable this option in the user preferences, as it is normally prevented by default, but it can be a useful way to drag the shots into the order you want to play them back, which can't currently be done in the Shots view. Note, however, that if you do this, it will change the shot's event numbers, so you do have to be a bit careful. Anyway, I want to undo the change I've just made, so I'll do that by pressing the Undo button on my control panel. You can also use the Command-Z keyboard shortcut, or you can select Undo from the Edit menu. Note that Daylight offers an unlimited level of undos, as the entire history of the scene is stored in the database. The shortcut for Redo is Shift Command-Z. Okay, I'll drag the Cuts view back to its normal size now. Below the Cuts view are some scopes and a histogram, and at the bottom of the screen is the same set of transport controls and the navigation bar we had in the Player workspace. To the left of the scopes is the Gallery. This is an area where grades and looks can be saved for use later on, or shared with other scenes and jobs. The upper part of the screen is the main Parameters area, which provides all the settings and controls for the currently selected image sequence or grading operator. To the left of the Parameters view is the Layers view, which will provide a thumbnail representation of the appearance at each layer within the shot once we start to build up a look by adding grades and other effect layers. On the right, we have the image display, and below that are the cursor controls, which are used to control and select what we view in the image display. I'll cover the subject of cursors in another tutorial. So this is the default Grade workspace, and as you can see it contains a lot of different controls and information. However, we can simplify it by removing some of the views we don't need right now. By holding down Control and right-clicking on a view, I can choose to hide that view from the workspace. So for now, I'm going to hide the gallery and the histogram. I'm also going to hide the cursor controls, but before I do that, I will just point out the color space setting here. It's important that this matches the current display I'm using to view the images. And as I've switched over from my external Rec 709 display to a window within the UI monitor, I should change this to sRGB to match the gamma of my computer monitor. I'll explain more about color spaces later on. Okay, now I'll hide the cursor's view by holding down Control and right-clicking on it to get the pop-up menu. I can now move the waveform monitor and vector scope to below the image display by holding down Control and then clicking and dragging with the left mouse button. Okay, now that I've set up this new workspace layout, I'm going to save it, so I can come back to it again when I need to. To save a modified workspace, you go to the Views menu and then select Manage Workspaces. The modified grade workspace is currently called Workspace 1, but I'm going to change that to Basic Grading. Notice that the keyboard shortcut, Ctrl-Shift-6, will allow us to quickly switch to this workspace in future. Right, we're now ready to start grading. I'll start off by jumping back to the first shot in the scene by clicking on this button. I can also do this by pushing a button on my Slate control panel or using the Command Home keyboard shortcut. Now, although the playback cursor has jumped to the start of the scene, and we can see the first shot in the image display, the thumbnails in the cuts view haven't moved. This is because the cuts view is currently not locked to the cursor position. To automatically scroll the cuts view so that the thumbnail for the currently selected shot is visible, we can turn on the scroll lock using this button. Now you can see that the playback cursor is situated at the left-hand side of the first thumbnail. Now you can't drag the cursor on the cuts view, but you can drag the one along the navigation bar, as in the player workspace. Okay, so we're now viewing the first shot in the daylight scene. As you can see, this is quite a dark shot as it was filmed at night, so I need to brighten it up a bit. I'll start by adding a grade layer. If you have a hardware control surface, such as the Filmlight Slate grading panel, then there are dedicated buttons for adding new layers. However, you can also add a new layer using the Add Layer button in the Layer Manager drop-down here, or you can simply press P on the keyboard. On the left, in our Layers view, you can now see that we have a new layer, Layer 1. And in the Parameters view, we have some grading controls. These controls are also mapped onto the hardware control surface. To the right of the grading controls is the Stack Manager. This provides access to the various grading operators which can be applied in this layer. Currently, we have the Film Grade selected. Again, these options are mapped onto buttons on the hardware control surface. The Film Grade is designed to emulate adjustments which could be made in a traditional film-based workflow. For example, increasing the exposure control would have a similar effect to changing the t-stop on the camera lens during filming. As I increase the exposure, you can see that the image does indeed respond in that kind of way. Now at this point I think we should talk a little bit more about color spaces. There are essentially two different types of color space that we are concerned with in film and TV workflows. Those which have a high dynamic range and a large color gamut, and those which have a much smaller dynamic range and only contain a relatively small range of colors. Modern digital cinema and TV cameras are capable of capturing a very large gamut of colors with a high dynamic range, whereas most electronic displays, such as LCD monitors and digital projectors, can only reproduce a relatively limited gamut of colors with a much smaller dynamic range. We refer to these two types of color space as scene-referred and display-referred spaces, respectively. Most professional digital cameras provide an option to record their images either in a RAW form, storing data directly from the sensor, or in some kind of logarithmically encoded format. Alternatively, the images could be converted internally within the camera's electronics into a color space which can be viewed directly on a TV monitor and recorded in that format instead. In the first case, where the camera records scene-referred RAW or log data, the originally captured high dynamic range and wide gamut images would still be available during the later stages in the post-production pipeline, and this is generally the preferred option for color grading. However, the second case, where the camera records images in a display-referred color space, has the advantage that the recorded data can be viewed directly on a monitor or projector, or even broadcast without requiring any further processing or color space conversion. Daylight can accept data which has been recorded in any colour space, and in fact you can easily mix raw, log and low dynamic range camera material, such as so-called Rec 709, all within the same daylight scene. Now, in order to do this, each source shot, or input sequence as we call them, needs to be tagged with an appropriate input colour space. In our example scene, the majority of the source footage was recorded in ARRI log-C colour space, and if I click on the Layer 0 thumbnail, it'll bring up the details of the input sequence. If you look at the colour space section, you can see that the input colour space has indeed been set to ARRI log-C wide gamut. The default setting in Daylight is to automatically read this information from the metadata in the movie file, as it considerably speeds up the initial process of importing material. However, if necessary, you can manually set the input colour space for each sequence by selecting it from this drop-down list. It's also important to set the correct colour space for viewing while you're grading, and if you remember, I've already shown you how that is set in the cursors view. Internally, Daylight uses a third working colour space as the grading colour space, but we won't worry about that for now. Colour space management is an important part of any colour grading workflow, and it is integral to the way Daylight works, so I will be covering it in a lot more detail in a separate tutorial. However, for now, we will just stick to the default settings, which were enabled as part of the setup we chose at the start of this set of introductory tutorials. Okay, so let's get back to the colour grading. Now, as I mentioned, this type of grade provides controls which adjust the RGB content of the image in a way which feels like adjusting the controls in a traditional film printing process. In fact, we can split each control into its separate RG and B channels and then adjust the colour balance using printer lights, just like working in a traditional film lab. I can also adjust the overall contrast in a shot in a kind of filmic way. If I want to reset these controls back to their neutral state, I can press the Reset button on my control panel or use the R button on the user interface. To reset all the controls within the film grade operator, I can either right-click in the Stack Manager and choose Reset Operator Entry, or I can press Command and Delete on the keyboard. There's also a Reset Operator button on my control panel. When I reset the film grade, you may have noticed that its name in the Stack Manager changed from blue back to white, indicating that it is no longer affecting the output image. Now, I could also achieve an exposure adjustment using lift gamma gain controls. On Daylight, these are found within the video grade operator. These are like the controls you used to find on most telecine color correctors. However, here we're using them on log-C data rather than video. Now, as this is just a basic dailies grade, I'm not going to do anything fancy or spend too much time on these shots, but I would like to get the colour looking a little bit more like it did on set. So now I'm going to add another layer, and then I'm going to use the film grade to make a small adjustment to the colour balance. By the way, I can make a bit more space for the parameters view by folding the Stack Manager out of the way by clicking on this little triangle button. Okay, that looks about right. Now, I could have applied both those adjustments in a single layer, but there are various reasons why you may want to use multiple layers to build up a look. We call all these layers together a grade stack. I can bypass an individual layer by pressing Command F11 on the keyboard, or by clicking on this bypass button at the top of the parameters view. I can also bypass all the layers in my grade stack by pressing F11 on its own. Note that if you find pressing F11 suddenly takes you back to the Mac desktop, you probably still have the F11 and F12 keys set up as default Mac shortcuts. You can disable those by going into the keyboard settings in your Mac system preferences. This is all covered in the separate tutorial on setting up your Daylight system. Okay, so I've graded the first shot. Now I'll move on to the next one. I can jump between shots in the cuts view using the X and Z keys on the keyboard, or by clicking on these buttons in the play controls. There are also buttons on my hardware control panel that do the same. Now this shot is just a second take of the first shot, so I want to just copy the same grade across. The quickest way to do that in Daylight is to simply drag the grade from the first shot onto the second one. And that looks okay, so we'll move on to the next. In fact, the next 3 shots are all takes of this same shot, so I'll select them as a group by command clicking on each one, and now I can drag and drop the same grade onto all of them at the same time. Okay, so let's move on to the next shot. Now looking ahead, I can see that we have the same shot appearing in a few places, but there are a couple of other shots in between. This is because we're currently viewing shots from both the A and the B cameras. So for now, I'm going to just worry about the A camera. If you remember, I created a filter selection for each camera in the last tutorial. Well, now I can select these filters by clicking on this button in the play controls. Now in the cuts view, I just see the shots from the A camera. These next 3 shots all look the same, so I want to apply the same grade to them. Once again, I'll select them as a group, but first I'll deselect the other group of shots by pressing Shift-Command-A on the keyboard. I'm going to copy the same base grade I used on the first shot, but this time I'll show you another way of copying and pasting the grade. Now you may have noticed this blue outline on one of the shots. Well, we call this the dark blue square, or DBS for short. It's used as a selector for certain operations, such as copy-paste. If I want to copy the grade from a certain shot, I can move the DBS onto that shot by simply clicking on it, and then use the Apply button to copy the grade onto my selected shots. The DBS is a very powerful feature in Daylight, and there are buttons on the Slate control panel to quickly move it around and perform various functions. I'll be covering those in more detail in other tutorials. Okay, so now I have a grade on these 3 shots, but it looks a little bright, so I need to reduce the level a bit. By going into the grouped grading mode, I can adjust all 3 shots at the same time. If you remember from the last tutorial, I can enable grouped grading by pressing Command-G on the keyboard. The red borders are now flashing, and if I reduce the gain control in layer 1, you will see that it affects all 3 shots. This is because in grouped grading mode, the same offset is applied to the controls in the same numbered layer on each shot in the group. Okay, I think that'll do, so I'll turn off group grading mode and I'll deselect this group. Now I can continue to work through the rest of the shots in my scene. And you can see that using groups and copy-paste operations, this can be quite a quick process. Clearly, this is just a very simple grade, and I haven't even begun to show you some of the more advanced grading tools and effects which Daylight has to offer. But we'll have to leave all that excitement for other tutorials.